Okay, I'm turning off your videos for now. You turn yourselves back on when Nina calls you.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna go press broadcast. Thank you, everybody.
Welcome all to this webinar. Today, we're here to discuss conflict in migration in times of COVID. And I can't think of a better opportunity to do so with our two panelists today, Professor Michael Chani from SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and Sara Perentino from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies based in Bologna. Before we begin and I introduce this panel in full, however, I'm going to invite my two colleagues, Helen Foster and Daniela Coleman, to talk a little bit about the new cooperative program that SOAS and Johns Hopkins have established.
Thank you, Professor Hall. My name is Daniela Coleman. I'm the Director of Admissions and Recruiting at SAIS. And this past year, we launched a cooperative degree with SOAS London and SAIS Europe for the Masters of Arts in International Affairs. Briefly, historically, the Masters of Arts in International Affairs is a 2-year research-based degree, but the beauty of the cooperative degree with SOAS is that students who are currently at SOAS can come and spend a year at SAIS Europe, or students in SAIS Europe can apply to participate at the cooperative degree with SOAS. It's an international program, it's research-focused, it provides a lot of flexibility, and it gives students an opportunity to have a footprint in both countries with a global student body. That's it for now. I'll ask Mrs. Foster to say a little bit about the SOAS London.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen Foster and I'm the coordinator for the dual degree from the SOAS side. I just want to say I'm really, really excited about this collaboration, and especially excited about the seminar today, which is the first of many, I hope. So over to you, Nina.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I can say I've been really looking forward to today's discussion too, to get to know both the arguments that Sara Penitino are going to put forward and Michael Charney from SOAS. For those of you who are just joining now, just to remind you, you've joined the Conflict and Migrations in Times of COVID-19, which is a webinar with both SOAS and Johns Hopkins SAIS based in Bologna. I'm Nina Hall. I'm Assistant Professor of International Relations, and I will briefly introduce today's topic and our two panelists before handing over to them. And we are going to have a lot of time for Q&A, so please already be thinking about that. So for many of you living around the world, I assume many of you won't just be in the UK or in the US or in Europe. We have mostly been focusing though on what's happening in our own lives during COVID, our own communities, our own societies. And today is an opportunity to think a bit more about what's been happening internationally, particularly around the issues of conflict and migration. And we know that conflicts haven't stopped because COVID stopped and, lockdowns have happened. The Yemen conflict is ongoing. They were in the midst of a humanitarian crisis before COVID hit. And as I understand, entered COVID with only half of the nation's health facilities operational in Yemen, that is. In Cox's Bazar, which I'm sure Professor Charney can speak more to, where there are about 1 million Rohingya refugees. It's one of the largest, if not the largest refugee camp in the world. We've had the first cases of COVID in the past week. There are obviously many other refugee camps around the world which will be asking similar questions of themselves of how do they keep refugees and asylum seekers safe during COVID times. We can think of the Greek islands where you've got about 37,000 people living in camps which were designed for just about 6,000. And of course, at the same time, we've got a number of countries, most countries closing their borders, even closing their ports, as we'll hear from Professor Penitino later. And not letting anyone in except perhaps their own citizens. So given these really difficult times, what does this mean for people who are living in conflict zones, who are migrants, who are asylum seekers? Well, we have two great speakers to share and to learn from today. First off, I'd like to introduce Professor Charney from SOAS, who's a military historian of Asia. He spent his career at the Center for Advanced Studies, National University of Singapore, the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia, University of Tokyo, and since 2001 at SOAS. His main research interests are the history of military logics, armies and warfare in modern and contemporary Asia, the historical culture of war in Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka and West Africa, and the emergence of religious and national cultures in Myanmar or Burma. He will be speaking to us first with a particular focus on Burma and understanding how COVID is playing out. And as I understand, things are changing daily. After that, we will hear from Professor Penitino, who's an associate professor of comparative public law at the University of Padua in Italy, as well as an adjunct professor of international human rights at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna. She's also a senior affiliated scholar of the Center for Constitutional Studies and Democratic Development. Her research areas include electoral management and in transitional and post-conflict countries, systems of electoral justice, constitutional bans on political parties, and she works with the Center of Excellence for Stability Police Units, training Italian and third country members of security forces with specific regard to human rights and policing, security, and humanitarian law. So I can't think of a better panel to give us some insights into COVID and how it's impacting on issues of migration and conflict. For those of you listening, we will have about 10 minutes for each speaker, followed by half an hour for questions and answers. And if you do want to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A box, not in the chat. That way we can make sure we get to your question. All right, I'll hand over now to Professor Charney, if you want to turn on your video and start.
It says now unable to start video. Maybe you have to control it from your end.
Let's have a look.
start my video. Okay, now I can start that. Thank you. So thanks for having me here, and I'm glad we had the opportunity to talk about this really important topic. I'm looking at the Rohingya mainly today, but in dealing with the problems of COVID for displaced peoples coming out of conflict zones. But I think for many migrant groups and stateless people, you're going to find some of the same kinds of problems. But because the Rohingya have had so much media attention, the spotlight's been on them, the things that are happening with them are much more visible. And we know more about what is happening in their case. These problems, you can look at these problems from a number of different ways, from different angles, but COVID really raises such a huge range of problems and effects that it's really only by looking at them from looking at them with the migrants themselves as a security referent, human security, that you can really grasp the scale of the risks and damage can really be fully understood. We also need to keep in mind that there's a huge disparity when you're dealing with the kinds of issues refugees from different conflict zones face because of the scale of people involved or the scale of resources that are available in different host countries. There's something like 79 or 80 million, maybe 81 million or so forcibly displaced people around the globe, and most are not being hosted in wealthy European countries or the US or something like that. They're mostly in lower middle income countries that can barely afford to host them themselves. So forcibly displaced people are some of the most marginalized and vulnerable people in the world. In the Rohingya camps, for example, you're talking about really extreme conditions, whereas if we're discussing the issues facing Iraqi, Syrian, or other Middle Eastern refugees from the wars that are being hosted in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, the issues can be less clear, although still important. So if we're dealing with Bosnia-Herzegovina, because of COVID, they've closed the communal kitchens, and the children have had to shift to online learning using individual computers. And the issue here is that displaced children need more psychosocial support in moving online than other children do. And that's a vastly different problem than the kinds of problems that I'll be talking about in the Rohingya camps. And timing is also an issue. COVID impacts new refugees because the state borders are being tightened now and people cannot get in and they can't get out. And many refugees are already across the border. The issues are more along the lines that they're deteriorating camp conditions in the camps they're in right now, and the diminishing likelihood of their ability to return to a safe area. So that is something, what's happening with COVID right now with the refugees, that's something on a very different scale than the problems that the problems being faced by the Rohingya themselves is on a vastly different scale than the kinds of problems I just mentioned. In Cox's Bazar, the challenges are more like open exposure to the elements, lack of drinking water, not to mention, just lack of water to be able to clean their hands, the kind of things we take for granted in trying to prevent COVID everywhere else, or increase as you isolate people into their residences, they become subject to more domestic violence because of the isolation and less able to access help. So anyone who's been to the camps knows that has been to the camps and seen the conditions and seen COVID coming, knows that it was a disaster waiting to happen. It's not just the world's biggest refugee camp. There are 860,000 people there and in nearby camps. I'd say it's also one of the world's most densely packed refugee camps. There's also a community culture that makes social distancing possible. It makes social distancing difficult, but it's the situation of the camps that makes social distancing almost impossible. And having been to the camps myself and seen them myself, it's literally impossible to undertake all the precautions residents in other countries would be able to do if they chose to do so or would be ordered to do so. So human rights experts have been trying to draw attention to this very likely hotspot for coronavirus spread for a while. All you needed was a couple of cases to start, and once the virus got in, then it's going to take off. And like it was mentioned in the introduction, it's already penetrated into the camps. Now, the human rights community is concerned about the Rohingya themselves, but the Bangladeshi hosts have to be concerned about their own populations. The camps are, it's not just the refugee camps. The refugee camps are in close proximity to Bangladeshi settlements. Something like 400,000 people are very close. You have interactions between the camps, some legitimate. Lots of Bangladeshis work in the services that connect to the camps, food carriers, all kinds of things. But you also have illicit connections that are less easy to control or monitor. Because of their vulnerable position, women and girls from the camps are secreted out at night, some of them to engage in prostitution, brokered by local Bangladeshis or by older women in the camps. We don't know how much of this has been shut down because of lockdown, obviously. But we know from other circumstances that traffickers can be extremely creative. So how much that has been shut down, I would doubt. Bangladesh is very much concerned about COVID for a lot of reasons, but amongst them is it's had a lot of development gains in the past couple decades. And if COVID is already a problem in Bangladesh, they've had 300 deaths, 18,000 cases so far. But if they have yet another cluster area like this, and it's going to be a big problem, the threat to the Bangladeshi economy and development gains is very realistic. So, so we might see a regional surge here because of the position of the camps. So Bangladesh has to be worried about the camps, not just for the Rohingya themselves, but also for the impact on Bangladeshis and also for the impact on the Bangladesh economy. Now, the response by most countries has been lockdowns to COVID, has been lockdowns and social distancing. This isn't a problem if you have resources, access to, like we do in the West, access to home deliveries, clean running water in your home. But for refugees everywhere, these measures often mean stopping access to clean water, working sanitation systems, access to food, support psychologically and emotionally, education, protection from domestic abuse. And how can you follow the required measures? Wash your hands is a good example when you don't even have access to clean water to drink, or you're so tightly packed together, you can't social distance. And COVID has also meant, depending on which group of refugees we're talking about, you know, about what do you do with new refugees coming in? You just make the situation denser. So that's been one of the reasons that I think it was referred to that Bangladesh is trying to move some of the Rohingya off to one of these camps on one of these islets to help reduce the dense settlement. Now, in the Rohingya camps, the Bangladeshi official responsible for repatriation and relief for refugees in early April announced that all services to the camps would be limited to critical services only. So this dropped 80% of the services, the humanitarian workers coming to the camps. And as a result, a lot of the infrastructure that would have worked otherwise is starting to fail. So in some areas, refugees are at risk of food shortages and water shortages. Some areas have no water at all, and food rations are not being replenished. Some of the areas have latrines that are overflowing because there's no staff to deal with them. And as a result, we raise the problem of infectious disease. So cholera becomes a risk if you don't have workers coming in and conducting vaccinations. Measles becomes a risk. And you wind up with this two-way syndemic problem. So other infectious diseases become compounded by COVID, or COVID becomes compounded by other infectious diseases. So like I said, the Bangladeshi authorities have tried to work proactively to deal with overcrowding. They built a camp on Basan Char Islet, which is controversial for a lot of reasons, but we're going to see a test right now. One of the reasons it's controversial is because it's barely above sea level, built on silt land, and right now, actually, as we speak, it's under threat from the cyclone Amphan. And we'll see what happens because 300 Rohingya refugees found on the coast, found adrift at sea, were moved there recently, and they're right now in a cyclone shelter, and unfortunately, they're going to be the test cases for how resilient that settlement is. At the main camps, the International Organization for Migration and other groups, they put in contingency measures for COVID. They built new isolation centers. They established a quarantine center for 400 or 500 people and half as many beds. They've upgraded the triage centers and all the primary care units and so on. But despite the precautions and despite all of the efforts made by the Bangladeshi authorities, we've seen that the contagion, as I mentioned again, has already hit the camp. So we had the first case almost, a week and a half or a little over a week ago. Now we're at 21 infections, and we had most recently new cases in one day. So we expect that to take off because we don't know how many people these infected people came into contact with. They're trying to find out who. But again, in a camp like this, one person walking through the camp comes into contact with hundreds, if not thousands of people in a day. And of course, you have a rolling exposure as a result. So, so this makes the densely packed nature makes dealing with the situation difficult. But what makes it really almost impossible is because of the Bangladeshi's the Rohingya's traumatic experiences with other governments, their long-term problems with the Myanmar state and how they were dealt with in Bangladesh initially, it has created a fear of the state, and as a result, they're reticent. If symptoms show up, they're reticent to reveal these to authorities. As a result, one of the rumors that's gone around is that if somebody shows some of the symptoms for COVID, that they'll be taken out of the camps and killed. So as a result, people are trying to downplay the symptoms as much as they can, and that just increases the time frame we're talking for exposure. So we have a real problem emerging. So as I mentioned, the Rohingya being viewed as a cluster for disease in Bangladesh is not a good thing for the Rohingya. There's political ramifications. They were already a source of political anxiety and furor and anger from local Bangladeshis before COVID. And once you become identified, if they become identified with COVID as it becomes a news item, then the problem for vulnerable communities like this is that once they become associated with crime or a disease or something else, that label sticks, regardless of the logics that are involved. So political pressure on the government to deal with Rohingya as a result may lead to more plans to relocate Rohingya onto islets so that they are out of reach of the Bangladeshi population, but also more also placed in more environmentally vulnerable positions. And there's also a domestic component to all of this. So when the Rohingya in the camps are free to move about, there are 15 safe spaces for women to go to talk about, to seek help for dealing with domestic abuse, to seek group counseling, to engage in literacy sessions that are empowering, to seek psychosocial support, to get tools training on how to deal with situations, skills training. But with the COVID lockdowns and everything, the non-essential, these are considered non-essential services, so they're no longer available during the COVID outbreak. So now you have this increased incidence, greatly increased risk of gender-based violence. So you got intimate partner violence, you've got other abuse, you got sexual exploitation, like I mentioned, directed at the most vulnerable of the vulnerable because of COVID. Now, COVID is also going to prevent a long-term resolution of the situation that led to their expulsion from Myanmar in mid to late August and a little bit after in 2017. The Rohingya were forced out of the country in that time after the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army supposedly attacked the police post. We won't go into the details of that because a lot of it's controversial and there's a great deal of doubt that this wasn't all planned as part of a program of genocide by the government. And of course, the notoriously brutal 33rd Light Infantry Regiment of the Domino had been moved in just a few weeks prior to this attack supposedly taking place. So there's a lot of doubt that this is just a response, and all the evidence suggests that this is just part of the longer term genocide against the Rohingya. Now, just to give you an idea of the scale of what they had undergone and why this is a problem now, according to the Ontario International Development Agency, their account, their study, 24,000 Rohingya Muslims were killed, 34,000 Rohingya were thrown into fires, 114,000 others were beaten, 18,000 Rohingya women and girls were raped by the army and the police, 115,000 Rohingya homes were burned down, and 113,000 Rohingya homes were vandalized. And of course, most recently, this conclusion has been backed by the International Court of Justice, and yet just yesterday or the day before, Myanmar issued a provisional order. An order had been issued to Myanmar to deal with this, and just recently, Myanmar has responded by saying it's put in place measures to stop abuse against the Rohingya and to not cover up the evidence of genocide. Now, if these promises are kept, it's great because COVID does something really nasty when it comes to vulnerable people like migrant communities. When they get hit by an epidemic, as I mentioned, the label sticks to them. And a migrant group that becomes associated with disease becomes a political target. Association with disease has historically, we know, been a great tool for othering. We've seen in the current COVID crisis, Italian populists claiming that COVID was spread in Italy by African refugees, and Hungarian populists have claimed that Iranian migrants spread COVID there. And associating particular groups with disease or disease-carrying qualities like vermin is part of the one of the 10 or 12 stages of genocide. And rationality doesn't enter into it because it appeals automatically to the baser human instinct to avoid the sick and stay healthy. So to turn the COVID against the Rohingya into a news item, particularly if it's a very bad outbreak, and you'll have that problem, a big problem in Bangladesh. But I think more importantly, it'll give more fuel to anti-Muslims in Myanmar who have been attacking Rohingya in social media. But COVID does something else, and it's going to make the Myanmar state much more effective in inflicting problems on the Rohingya and keeping them out. It will give a legitimate facade to Myanmar's concern about not wanting the Rohingya as a population, a particular time and place. They will also become a cluster that can be legitimately claimed by the Myanmar state to be a public health concern, that they're a potential health threat if they get returned, if they're moved out of where they are. Myanmar won't have to rely on old arguments that the Rohingya aren't Burmese, that they're colonial migrants, and all these other things that have been discounted. They can now refuse to readmit Rohingya on the basis that they are a potential public health threat. They should not be moved back to Rakhine. They should remain in isolation legitimately. And so concern over public health is now weaponized as a result by the Myanmar state. And if COVID continues to be around, and whether it's in waves or remains endemic, we don't know how it's going to pan out for the next few years. The sense is that the sense that Rohingya must remain in place where they are is only going to get strengthened. And the biggest problem, though, is that COVID has strengthened globally this pre-existing political shift to the right, both the nativist xenophobia you see in nominally democratic societies, and the newfound sense of security in the kind of administrative efficacy nominally authoritarian states can offer. Democracies haven't done well in coping with COVID, and authoritarian regimes have, and this has wound up making transnational migrants more vulnerable. You normally have this tension between commitment to universal human rights, the right to self-determination, but as you securitize in response to perceived threats of transnational migration, as these get voiced and securitized, you have a shift to stronger border control at the expense of human rights. And COVID makes everybody feel threatened all the time, and it's made globalization look bad and foreign migrants as the symptoms of the problem. Now, I realize that I've gone on way too long, so I'm going to stop here, but I should point out that, we see migrants as the problem, but they contribute really important things, and one of them is that you had a lot of undocumented migrants and so on, taking up jobs in the Malaysian rubber glove industry that locals wouldn't take. And then once the Malaysian government faced political pressure, they got rid of them. And so we actually faced a paucity of rubber gloves as a result when COVID hit. So, we're vulnerable too when we don't take care of these people. So let me stop there, and I'll leave that to the next speaker, who will probably pick on some of the themes I raised. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Chani. That was a great start to our conversation. Professor Finencino, are you able to share your screen?
I think I am. Go ahead and start my video. Okay, here I am. So I just wanted to pick up from where Professor Carney left regarding this idea of securitization of borders and the antithesis with human rights protection. What I'm going to try to do is to give you an example, well, to talk about an event that I think exemplifies in legal terms this process, meaning how COVID-19 and measures that have been implemented as a response to COVID-19 are exacerbating a trend in securitization of borders, which will lead possibly on the long term to a detriment of the level of protection of human rights of refugees and migrants in general, not only in Europe, which is my main area of expertise, specifically the Mediterranean, but I think across the globe. And in order to, due to my previous experiences in webinar, I tend to think that having pictures to look at while you hear a voice on the background, I think it's useful. So I'm sharing some pictures in a PowerPoint presentation. There is no attempt to, let's say, be complete in the description of the information. This is just to invite you to follow my stream of thoughts. This picture I thought I should share because I wanted to focus my attention exclusively to refugees that are fleeing their country of origin by sea, via the sea. This is what we usually refer to as refugees by boat or seaborne migration flows. This is an experience which, again, is very common in many areas of the world, and that historically has been progressing over time in different phases, and I will speak a little bit about that. But I thought that this was a good way to offer you an insight on how I think that legal issues are a good evidence or a good proof of this trend of exacerbation of phenomena that were already present before COVID-19, and that the pandemics, I fear, will consolidate. The way I thought I could connect with Michael's focus was by recalling a very recent and sad news, which is that of a boat that was full of Rohingya refugees that were trying to flee Bangladesh in order to reach Malaysia, the shores of Malaysia. This boat was left adrift for more than 2 months. If you can imagine what it must mean to be stuck on a very small object, which is left adrift right in front of the shores of the country that you're trying to reach in order to save your life, I think you can easily understand the multiple human rights implications of this situation, not only those that pertain more specifically to people as refugees or people as humans or people as citizens of a third state that are trying to access an independent sovereign state. From a legal standpoint, this very difficult human condition, it's very hard to translate. One other point that I'm going to try to raise very briefly in this presentation is that the idea of a boat person, the idea of a human being at sea and the law failing, international law and human rights law failing this subject in truly defining the jurisdiction which is due to protect him and is due to recognize him as a subject of law. Anyhow, you can easily, by putting yourself in the shoes, if you can, of anybody that is left adrift on a boat for more than 2 months, you can definitely already identify which could be the multiple human rights violations and abuses that would be involved in such a scenario. Why was the boat adrift in front of Malaysia? Of course, Michael has given you all the insightful information about the political and economical and sociological dynamics between Bangladesh and Myanmar. But of course, the main, and in this case, Malaysia as well. He didn't mention it, but I put it in the picture. But the point is, the boat was left adrift for 2 months because of very specific regulations that were linked and justified on the basis of protecting Malaysia from possible, from the pandemic of COVID-19. And this is not uncommon. This is something that many states in Southeast Asia have done. I have here a map from IOM, which clearly gives you an overview of all the blocked or fully closed port of entries in the region. So this is not something which was exclusive on the side of Malaysia. Specifically, when it comes to seaports, the policy is called the policy of closed ports. In other words, the idea is that for very exceptional reasons and in very specific occasions, international law, maritime law, which is a piece of international law, will guarantee the possibility to a sovereign state to shut down their ports and not allow disembarkation on the territory of the state itself. This is a possibility foreseen in international law as an exception to the ordinary rule. However, what we have witnessed in the area of the Mediterranean Sea is that this policy, which again goes back in time with regard to its origin, has gone completely out of hand and has transformed into a policy tool which is declined in the realm of international relations and European Union policy making and national politics. And despite, again, being an issue which was raised for the first time a very long time ago, I put a bunch of let's say, milestones with regard to the idea of universal boat person. You can maybe refer to the 1975 so-called Southeast Asian exodus, where people from Vietnam at the end of the war tried to flee Vietnam in order to find a safe harbor elsewhere. We had then the case, which was a negative, if you are a human rights advocate, which was a negative case decided by the US Supreme Court in 1993, when the court rejected the interpretation of the Constitution, which provided for an obligation to have the disembarkation of Haitian refugees on the territory of the United States. And then, of course, the very well-known case of the Adelaide Navy ships from the Australian Navy, which put in practice what has come to be known as the policy of moral blackmail, which was the idea that the Australian Navy had to disincentivize the ships with the cargoes of refugees, the ships full of refugees that were trying to enter Australian territory, by using deceptive techniques as such of hiding behind the line of the sky in order for the ship not being able to see the Navy boat of the Australian Navy, thus not creating an obligation under international law to rescue the boat itself. All these antecedents somehow, and again, this newly global policy after COVID-19 has also reached and has also peaked for a whole series of combined reasons in the Mediterranean Sea in the last 2 decades. You're all probably all well aware of these figures, but between 2013 and 2019, trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea has caused more than 15,000 casualties. And these people are dying on a daily basis, reported and unreportedly. There is no investigation about the actual numbers, and as you're well aware, most of the time it's very difficult to search and find the rest of the boats and of the people that attempted the crossing of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, how is the concept and how is the legal tool of closing a port under international law relevant to our idea that there is a consolidation of very bad trends in terms of human rights protection after COVID-19? I thought I could bring two examples. One is, these are both very recent. We're talking about not even 10 days ago. So first example is that of Malta. Malta has closed immediately its ports after the declaration of the state of emergency due to COVID-19. And it has also hired private vessels in order to intercept potential migrants that were trying to reach the shores of the islands. These policies are being put in place with the idea that there is a necessity to protect the country from an outside threat, which is exactly what Michael was referring to before. But in actual terms, this is just a consolidation of a very legally wrong interpretation of what the exception of closing a port means under international law. Even more recently in Italy, migrants these days are being kept quarantining on regular ferry boats because ports have been declared not safe, unsafe places, thus they are closed, and the Ministry of Transportation and Ministry of Health and the Minister of Transportation is not allowing any type of disembarkation for refugees that were either rescued by humanitarian organizations or that independently got very close to the shores of the Italian Republic. I gave a talk 7 days ago on the problem of quarantining people on ferry boats that are docked in front of Italian cities. In this one case, the first one would be in front of Palermo, which is the capital town of Sicily, and the other one that I'm going to mention now is actually in front of is looking Libya. Basically, is looking at Libya. Is in front of Ponte Empedocle, which is very close to the African shores. Anyhow, we already had the hint that this would have been this was a solution that would have led to the exacerbation of the violations of human rights that had already put in place under regular administrative detention in Italy in the past. And too well we knew about that because this was confirmed a couple of days ago. A refugee lost a person that was seeking for the recognition of the status of refugee in Italy, and that was being kept in quarantine on one of these ferry boats. This would be the second one, called the Moby Zaza ferry boat, jumped off the ship in an attempt to reach the shores of Italy and get away from whatever is inside those ferries and that we are not aware of. Now, this is not to, let's say, be particularly I don't want to be an alarmist. I fully trust the government in the sense that they are doing their best in accommodating whatever the situation might be on these ferry boats and even on land, because we know that many are kept in hubs that are not under the scrutiny of any neutral third human rights organization, independent, let's say, monitoring activity. There's none of that. But more in general, what preoccupies me is that the trend of understanding administrative detention and the way disembarkation is used as the focal point of understanding the jurisdiction around people at sea, I think this will consolidate in the future and is not going to improve in a positive sense for human rights record. I threw a lot of issues on the table, and I hope that maybe with the questions I can be more precise on what you guys are interested in.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Finicino. We now have 20 minutes for question and answers. It's a great opportunity for those of you listening in who are considering coming as students to either both SAIS and SOAS, now that you can come to both together in a 2-year degree, learn a little bit from these experts. So I'd encourage you to put any questions you might have in the Q&A, and then we will go through them thematically. I'm waiting patiently for our first question askers right now. As I do so, I might ask a first question to warm us up to both for others. So I wondered, Professor Chani, you talked a lot about the difficulties with Cox's Bazar and some of the, I thought at the end, the real challenge of wanting to alert in a way the international community to this potential, what is going to be hopefully not too bad a crisis with the spread of COVID, but also the problems of racism, of how this will be instrumentalized if it is publicized as, you know, here's this massive virus that's within the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar. So how do you think humanitarian organizations should respond to this? How should they navigate this so they don't, you know, feed racism? And are there any states, you've mentioned Bangladesh, of course, but others who are taking any leadership to either provide additional assistance or offering places for Rohingya? Have you seen anything develop there?
Well, not so much for offering places for Rohingya, and Rohingya who have been hosted in other places in the past, in Saudi Arabia, for example, from another period, they haven't fared very well. They're not going to move from where they are. In terms of how can agencies deal with this in such a way that racism doesn't take off, it's not going to be resolved within Myanmar. That is not something that international organizations can do. Outside, how do you prevent something like this from happening? Through education and ensuring that people know that the COVID spread to the Rohingya, not from them. So they are a symptom of the problem that Bangladesh already faces. They're not the cause of this. And that's been part of the problem everywhere, hasn't it? That people forget where things really come. And that people forget that this circulates widely, and they try to pin it down on different people and blame different groups. That's the political side of all this. So I guess the answer is fighting the political discourse of the extremists right now, because they're the ones who are going to pick this up.
Yeah, and I read recently a very interesting analysis of COVID situation from David Miliband, who's head of the International Rescue Committee, looking at some of these tensions of nationalism and globalization. And if those of you who are interested listeners and understanding how some humanitarian agencies are responding.
Can I add too that it also means keeping pressure up on Facebook and other social media to prevent that kind of the kinds of stories that circulate through social media in the past, to keep them out of the picture.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really interesting point as well that's come up in a lot of the commentary around COVID. Is it's a time where governments are using all sorts of digital surveillance tools in order to try and keep communities safe, but also there's a concern that they may be expanded and used for other purposes, both by governments and or by other forces. We have a question, which is great, from an anonymous attendee. And this is really for you, Professor Pinicino. Are there any alternative policies that Mediterranean governments could implement to preserve as many human rights as possible while preventing the spread of the virus? And I think this was something that was completely on my mind, if I can add to it. Are Italian authorities going to open the ports anytime soon? They're opening their borders to tourists, so are they going to open their ports to migrants?
I doubt it, and well, thank you for the question, first of all. I doubt it, and I think that's exactly what I meant by COVID-19 being the excuse to consolidate practices that unfortunately were already there before COVID-19. Just to give you an idea, the very first hint of Italy systematically using the policy of closed ports with regard to migrants dates back to 2015. So it is when Italy decides to take charge of Libya's rescue area saying, well, Libya is not going to be able to do that, so we will take care of that. We're going to deal with that directly. It's from that moment on, in the shifting between one political majority and the other as governing the country, that the policy of safe ports has been used in order to, number one, consolidate the populist agenda, as Michael was saying before. Number two, for mere campaigning objectives. Oh, look how I can how I can close out the problem. Look how practical. This is just common sense. How come nobody ever did this before, right? I'm just going to shut down. I'm going to shut the doors. But number three is and this is what I referred to when I meant when I mentioned the international relations realm and the European decision-making realm. Closing ports for Italy has been throughout time the threat, the legal tool that has been used to leverage the reform of the Dublin Treaty in the European Union and the way, the very unbalanced way in which different member states are dealing with the consequences of the migration flows of the first decade of the 21st century. So again, are there? Yes. There are multiple options. The problem is that if you frame them in the Rex Sextantibus, according to the way things are right now, I see it very hard to be able to simply substitute the piece of the puzzle, because then it has to satisfy all the other variables. The preferred options, if I may, the preferred option of the Italian government regarding Dublin and regarding the seaborne migrant flow is the creation of humanitarian channels, humanitarian corridors, excuse me. This is the preferred solution. And the Vatican has done this, by the way. The Vatican has proven that they can actually open a humanitarian corridor with Somalia and Ethiopia, well, not regarding specifically citizens of Ethiopia, but from Ethiopia to Italy for refugees from other countries in the area. And this is the preferred idea of the Italian state, that at that point would never be the first stop for a refugee. Refugee would always want to go north, would always want to move on and go elsewhere. So yes.
Great, and we have 4 questions now in the Q&A. So I'm gonna cluster them a little bit. So from Rocho Ferro Adams, who says he's speaking from a research capacity, this is for both of you. How much interest has there been by humanitarian agencies in the UN to investigate or monitor what's going on? First of all, in Malaysia and Bangladesh, and secondly, in Italy and Malta. And if I can add to that another question, which is, how has the delivery of aid into refugee camps, Rohingya and other, actually been affected by the crisis? So, Professor Chani, if you want to start.
Well, in reverse order, as I mentioned, the access workers have, because of lockdown, has been dramatically reduced. So you have much fewer aid workers going in, so you have less aid going in, right? And so that's been dramatically impacted. The first question, they've disappeared. I was reading them and now they've disappeared off the screen. I'm trying to remember. The first one was, interest in investigating. Yeah, there's always international humanitarian interest in investigating any of these things, but there's so much going on in the world. And with lockdown right now, it's pretty much impossible to do that. It's also the fact that these things are very politically volatile issues for the states that are involved, because they're inflicting much of this. I think also a point I did make, and a point that really needs to come out, is that like Guterres pointed out a couple last year or something, that internationally the state paradigm has trumped the human rights paradigm, and we're really talking about states, the emphasis on states, state security and states' rights. And if you're a stateless person, you're pretty much screwed. Nobody's thinking about your security. So yeah, it depends on international organizations probably to draw attention to these things and to help moderate or to help to deal with these situations with refugees, but standing in their way are the states, okay, that don't want them to get involved. Could I just throw in too, just really briefly, the question on terrorism and counterterrorism?
Please do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, it also depends on who you're talking about, which state, because in Myanmar, there's very specific consequences of COVID. One of them is that, you know, the Arakan Army and other groups, they've called for a ceasefire. They try to have a ceasefire so people can deal with the spread of COVID and to stop this national problem. But the Burmese military has been still taking advantage of the shroud of invisibility that's been put over Burma to take care of these, to attack these groups and to try to establish further entrench their control. If we're talking about the terror landscape and counterinsurgency in other places, the Middle East and everything, that's a different type of question that I probably would not want to add to right now. Yeah, can I leave that to Sarah, maybe to add?
Sure. Yeah.
I'm going to start with a brief comment on the terrorism issue, which I think, we can also recall what Nina was saying in advance about technology. There's this very interesting intersection in terms of timing and in terms of geography, where a trend that was already building, which was that of the use of technology for detection purposes with regard to migration, not only in the area of jurisdiction of the state, but transnationally, which is peculiar. Just to translate this in very simple terms, we're talking about collecting fingerprints and biometrics in Niger for whatever group of people that are fleeing Nigeria and that would like to reach the shores of Libya and that are looking at crossing the sea and reach Europe. That is it preoccupies me already enough, but if you cross that with what terrorism left us in legal terms, as an inheritance, as a heritage, is the idea of the anticipation of protection. An enhancement of the concept of national security, and the combination of the two nicely translate in the idea of closing a port to the access of refugees, because that is necessary to protect your territory. Like refugees were some kind of invading army that you, by the way, have already recorded and classified well in advance before they reach the shores of your country. So I don't know exactly how terrorism and anti-COVID legislation will cross over and what will come out of this, but I know what the trend will be. The trend will be anticipation. All the legislation, for example, that in Europe we have against radicalization, and the idea that I can read your Facebook and imply stuff about you because that's what you wrote on your Facebook. So that must mean something. So you can be put under surveillance. Your phone calls can be listened to, and the mass of legislation and the possible restrictions on individual freedoms are massive. If you combine this with these apps on where you go, why you move, and it's a very complicated. I see very complicated scenarios ahead of us.
Thank you. And there's a question I think that builds on this comment, which is a little outside perhaps of your expertise, but what do you both see that individuals can do to keep up pressure on social media giants like Facebook? Are there particular things in the Myanmar case in Rohingya, because obviously Facebook was very involved in instigating and being a facilitator of ethnic violence there, or in your own work, Professor Benigno, are there areas where you can see individuals putting pressure on Facebook through legal instruments?
Can I throw in before you'll have the more detailed legal answer? I'll throw in that I think in a way Facebook, because of all the tension because of the Rohingya and the situation there, that Facebook is now woke. When I'm talking about pressure, I should probably put in the way that you can actually help Facebook by just being vigilant and reporting if you see this kind of activity taking place. I'm less aware of what Instagram or something like that might play, little that might play. We are aware of what Facebook was responsible for, and Twitter, and obviously that has been at least they've begun to try to address that. Okay, I'll leave the more legalistic answer to Sarah.
I wish I had it. I actually, I'm kind of where you are, because truth of the matter is that there is no way for a state to bind Facebook to any possible rule. They are doing that themselves. So content-wise, we are getting, this is another very interesting trend. And for students that are keen on international law, I think that this is the beginning of a new individualization of international law. Facebook creating its own court to decide whether the content was appropriate or not. They created a panel of justices that will run on a parallel with ordinary courts. I'm not expert, but when you're too big to be tried, I again, hopefully, I would agree in saying that Facebook is kind of woke right now, so it's not going to take actions with regard to human rights sensitive issues or human sensitive discourse. But again, I don't think they are aware of the ways in which they can play for the wrong team in this whole situation.
Yeah.
And if I may, as a matter of example, human trafficking, selling human beings is all being carried out on the regular internet. A very small part of this traffic is actually managed in the so-called dark deep web, where nobody can access.
Yeah.
Not true. Most of the transactions and most of the indirect information that regard human trafficking, both for sexual exploitation and for work exploitation, actually runs through regular social media. So yes, there's a wokeness regarding explicit manifestation, and then there's knowledge and being woke about indirect effect. But yeah.
These questions, I think, on Facebook are very interesting, and I could add more, but I know that as Professor Panagino has said, there's a lot of areas in political science and international relations developing as well, monitoring the EU's initiatives to try and do more in terms of setting rules and governance in that space. But I think it's taking us a little bit off topic. So I want to focus our final question, given we're coming right up to time now, on quite a provocative question in a way. And I think it's a good one to finish on, which is it ever morally acceptable to try and stop these immigrants or any immigrants or asylum seekers with the excuse of stopping COVID-19? Because of course, that's in a way at the heart of some of our paradox in today's panel, is that, you know, all sorts of rules that we never thought or expected we would all be told to stay at home, you know, infringement of individual rights, are there, you know, is it morally acceptable? So if you both want to comment on that and make any final statements as we round off today's panel.
Well, I would say that again, to refer back to, this is going to be used politically. So this will be, as we also saw in other speakers' talk, Sarah's talk, this is used in the wrong way. But that we do, not allowing them in is not the same thing as not helping them, and there is responsibility to protect. And you don't have to have people crossing borders to put pressure on other states to deal with them appropriately in a health way, give them access to health care people and this kind of thing. So there are other ways to deal with the issue other than just, you know, the issue of letting them cross the border or not. My fear is how this is going to be used in the long term politically.
Sarah.
I agree to the point where I think this shows the problem of using the way safe port rules has been used over time. Why this obsession with disembarkation? Why this obsession with crossing? Most of the time, this is, of course, it's a moral obligation. This is a legal obligation. Most countries have signed conventions that do not have as an option that of saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna bring you water, I'm gonna send you a doctor on boat, but I'm not gonna get your application for the recognition of as a refugee. This is not an option. This is law that is being made case by case by aggressive populist political majorities. My concern is more, if we have a moral imperative, my concern goes more towards the way our countries participate in policy of management of this type of phenomenon. Deterrence, militarization, externalization, they're being informed about what your government is doing with regard to external action as a form of management of migration. I think it's even more important as a question, to be honest. Is that moral to send our military boots on the ground to try to stop the migration flow through SAIS? Are we aware of this? Is this a decision that has been taken according to constitutional procedures? Anybody discuss this? So again, crossing the border and disembarking is super important, and I think we have a legal and moral obligation to let that happen, but I think our concerns should go further back.
Wonderful. And I think on that note, it's a great way to finish off our webinar. Thanks to all of you who asked questions, and sorry we didn't get through them all, but I think the fact that you still have questions is great because it shows that you're eager to come and learn from both Professor Chani, from Professor Penicino, and we would invite you and welcome you to obviously ask more questions of us. And if you're interested in the program, of course, to our colleagues Helen Foster at SOAS and Daniela Coleman in terms of admissions or how it all works to come do this dual degree program or cooperative degree program. So thank you very much to both of the speakers. A round of applause from me. It was wonderful to hear your reflections on this important topic at this time. And thanks also to all the organizers involved.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.